The binding on a quilt is the final stage to get that quilt finished, and it really can make or break a project. You don't want to invest all that time into your patchwork and then your quilting to then find that the binding goes on and it all goes horribly wrong. So this is how I approach it to get it perfect every time. First, you're going to need to cut your strips. Now, if your fabric is bigger than the cutting board that you're going to be cutting those on, I have already got my fabric folded in two. I'm going to fold it into four. With a sharp rotary cutter, you're going to find it's going to get through no problem at all. So I'm just going to line these up at the top here. And then on the board, I can now fit the entire width of my fabric so I can cut my strips easily. So I am going to level the bottom fold along the line here so that I know I'm sitting square. And then the first thing I'm going to do is just cut a bit off here to make sure that I'm working with a perfectly straight edge before I start cutting my strips. So I'm holding my mat in place, slicing this off and removing that's some rubbish. So I am going to need to cut strips to go the entire way around my quilt. So my quilt that I'm working on today is 1 meter square, which means I'm going to need 4 meters minimum of binding in order to be able to get all the way around. So for the fabric, and I know how much I've got here, I'm going to need to cut myself 4 strips. So the width of the strip should be anywhere between 6 to 8 centimeters or 2.5 to 3 inches, depending on how you like to work. So I'm going to cut some 8 centimeter strips today. I quite like a thick binding on this quilt. That's all it comes down to really, is how dominant you want your binding to be. So you can see there I've got my 8 centimeters. Would be cut on the bias, but for a quilt binding you'll find you don't really need them cut that way. You're not really looking for them to be stretching in any way. So in order to save fabric, I'm just cutting them with the grain. Well, technically at a 90-degree angle to the grain, if you can see the selve edges up there. That's because I decided I wanted the fabric to be this way, this orientation on the binding, so that you got all the colours rather than just the strips. So the next job we have is to seam these together so that we have one long piece of binding, and the way we're going to do that is with angled seams. So we're going to take strip number 1. When you're working with selve edges, you can either cut your selve edges off so that you don't have to worry about them, or you can just overlap with the selve edges off the fabric. And strip number 2, and we're going to place them at a right angle like this. So I've got one strip coming across and one strip going down, and then I'm going to be stitching them in this direction from this point all the way down to this one, so that we'll get a nice angled seam. And what that will mean is when your strips open out, you will get this nice angled seam. And what that's going to do is when you fold your binding, you're going to really reduce bulk by having the seam not sitting on itself everywhere. And so we're going to do that twice more until all of our strips are seamed together. So I have now sewn all of my angles, and now I'm going to trim the seam allowance back because we don't need that much bulk sitting inside. So we'll get rid of that, that's rubbish. And then what we're going to do is we're going to be pressing these seam allowances open. Again, that's going to really reduce bulk. That's the aim of what we're trying to do with a binding. We don't want anything too bulky sitting in one particular location, so you can see that bulk's really nicely spread by using the angled seam. So whilst we're at the iron, we're going to be pressing these open, but we're also going to press this binding in half, wrong sides together, so that we can see the right side. This is where this method differs from a traditional binding. A traditional binding, you would be folding in the 2 raw edges as well as folding it in half, so that you end up with this effect. That's not what we're doing with this quilt binding today. We are folding it in half like so. So here we have my one long strip of binding with its lovely angled seams that really aren't bulky at all. and it's beautifully pressed all the way along. So now we need to attach our binding to our quilt. Now, before we start attaching the binding, it's worth considering the finish that you're planning to have at the end of it. And what I mean by that is the first half of your binding will be stitched on by the machine. That's always the case. But when it folds over, this other side needs securing down. And there are a few different ways that this can be done. And depending on which of those methods will depend on which side of your binding you want to attach this first side. So I am attaching my binding onto the top side of the quilt. This is the patchwork side that I have done, and this is my plain backing. The reason for this is because I like to finish the second half of my binding with an invisible hand stitch. So I just ladder stitch this second edge down to my backing. But if you wanted to finish it on a machine, I would suggest starting by attaching your binding onto the back. And the reason for that is because then when it folds over to the front, you can make sure that from this top side, the side that you want predominantly to be seen, you can get your stitching in the perfect location. If you do it the other way around, what you'll find is you might end up where you're slightly on, slightly off all the way around with your top stitching. And that applies whether you're going to do a standard straight stitch or whether or not you are going to do a decorative stitch. I would always suggest, if you're going to machine the second part of your binding on, to attach it onto the back so that when it folds over to the front so that you can secure it nicely there. If you're going to hand stitch, then I do the opposite and I start on the front and work my way over to the back. And it doesn't matter which edge you start on, but the really important thing is that we're going to start halfway along. We're not going to start at a corner. So I've got corner to corner over here. So I'm going to start halfway, and we're going to start leaving a tail. We don't want to start right at the edge. It's going to make the seaming process much harder. So we want to leave probably a good 30 centimetre tail here. And then we are going to keep our raw edges of our quilt and our binding together, and we will be stitching down. Now you can pin this, you can just take it to the machine if you feel confident enough, and keep the two together. But what we will be doing is we will be stitching until we get to the corner, and then we will be stopping, and I will show you how we're going to do the corner turn in order to then start the next line. So when we stop at a corner, we want to stop the same distance from this raw edge as we are from our raw edge here, so that we stop taking into account the seam allowance. So what that would mean is if I was stitching a centimetre away here, I would make sure that I'm stopping approximately a centimetre in here, so that I'm not going any further than that. That's going to make the turning process much, much easier to get around this corner. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to stitch from here all along here to here. Now I tend to stitch my quilt binding on with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. I quite like the weight that it gives the binding inside once it's all folded over. But if you're going for a slightly narrower binding, you'll want to potentially do 1/4 of an inch using your 1/4 inch seam foot, or anything really, as long as you're consistent all the way around and have made sure that your binding is wide enough to account for whatever seam allowance you're going for, it's fine. Now obviously you can always trim things back if they're not turning, but ideally we wouldn't have to do with that because we would have trimmed our quilt to size before we begin. So I have stitched that first half aside, so I've got my tail here, started at the center point of this edge, and I have stitched all the way up to this corner here, leaving the same seam allowance here as I've given myself here. Now, the corner turn. One of those important things, if we just pulled it like this, you'd find the corners went rounded, which we don't ideally want. Things start to get a little bit strange looking. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a little pleat in the corner. So to do that, we're going to fold it up and then fold it back down. And with it in that position, you are going to stitch from the same point here all the way down this length until you get to the other corner. So just like before, we are stitching, leaving our seam allowance intact here so that we're not ideally stitching any further up. It will still work even if you have, it's not a problem, but to keep things neat, we want to try and make sure we're stopping at the right point. If I pop the pin in this way, you can see why we've got how this is going to all work. So if you see, what we've now created is our nice little pleat that is going to form the corner of our quilt. We will do the same method behind when we fold it, and you get these beautiful square corners on your quilt, and it's super easy to do. So I will show you again. So I've got my binding and I have gone up and then down, so that I've got this double triangle sitting there, and then I'm going to stitch all the way along till I get to the next corner, and then I repeat and repeat and repeat until I get back to here. Now once I've gone all the way around and I've done all of my corners, I will be stopping approximately here-ish, so I'm leaving 20 to 30 centimeters where I will hopefully then have a tail, and I will show you how to do our seam to join our bindings together. So my binding is now all stitched on with all of my corners with their lovely extra little flappy bits here so that they turn nicely. And I have got round to the beginning where I've got this gap where obviously I haven't sewn it on, and my two loose pieces here. So what you're aiming to do is to cut these at a very specific overlap. So first thing I do is make sure that you've got plenty of overlap, and then I'm going to cut myself, actually I'm going to cut this one down just ever so slightly so that its raw edge sits about halfway between where I have finished stitching, which looks like it's about here. Now don't discard this piece because it's going to give you a really important piece of information, because the amount we need it to overlap by is the width of our binding, the width when it is open. So we are going to give them a little stretch because we want them to be nice and tight. We're going to lay one on top of the other, and then I'm going to use this piece to give me the width, and then I'm going to cut this top one so that it overlaps by the exact width of my binding. So you can see now as I'm stretching it so that it fits nice and tight so I don't end up with any loose bits, and I have trimmed it so that this is now overlapping by my binding width. The binding width when it is open, not when it is closed. So with that cut, you're going to place them together just like you did when you were seaming them before, so that they are at right angles to each other, so that I've got one binding headed left, one binding coming down, and I'm going to put my pins in to show you where I'm going to stitch, because I'm going to do my angle again. So that you see when they flip open, you can see it's already doing it. See how it is now a perfect fit to be seamed onto the quilt. So all we have to do is stitch our angle there. So I have stitched my angle on. I am going to trim this off because we don't need this bulk inside the quilt, and then finger press this open because we only need it open for long enough for it to stay that way when we stitch it, which we're going to do imminently. So I can fold it down like so, and now you will see it is a perfect fit for me to finish stitching that last bit on, and the seam looks like every other seam that you've got on your binding all the way around. Really nice and neat. So that is now stitched on, and you will see here I've had ever so slightly a bit of movement that's happened in the fabric. It's why we stretched the strips slightly as I was measuring them. I wouldn't lose any sleep over anything like this, because you see when you fold it out you can't see it at all, and that's the key thing. So once we've got our binding strips all attached all the way around our quilt, it is time to turn them and secure them on the other side. So we're going to fold them out. We will fold them around to the other side, and then they will be secured down on the other side however you like. Now this is the reason why I absolutely love this method, is because there's no fiddling at this point. Because we folded it in half, We've got this lovely folded edge, no raw edges in sight, so it's really easy to just fold it to the other side and secure it down, either for hand stitching or for top stitching on the binding into place. It is worth always checking at this point that whatever you're going to do, you can see some of my backing is a little bit on the scant side versus the size of my front of my quilt, that you're always covering any of those raw edges that may be visible. Now, when you get to your corners of quilts are always the bit that throws people. So you are going to fold it all the way up to the corner. Let me pop a pin in here, keep it nice and neat. And then you'll see it's already wanting to do what you want it to do. You're going to put that same little pleat in that you have on the other side. And I'm doing that just by allowing this edge to continue, so that when I fold it up, I've got a nice little triangle trapped in there. And it really does give the most beautiful little bound corners. And that's it. So once that's all secured on, the binding will be finished. As you can see, I am going around my seam allowance. If you haven't got enough binding to be able to get, you can always trim that down to give yourself a bit more room to be able to pull over, but you want your quilt batting to be inside your binding. You don't want to be trying to force it to the inside. The binding is always visible from the front and from the back. That's why it's always important to choose a fabric that goes with both sides of your quilt that you've chosen. I tend to just always go very brightly coloured and things always work out fine. And they will be secured on. And then after you've tidied up any other little loose errant threads that you might have on your quilt, it is finished. So hopefully that all made sense. If you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the comments or find me on Instagram and drop me a message. I'd happily answer any other questions you may have. But fingers crossed you followed all of that and your binding will now be absolutely perfect.